Thank you for being back so quickly, but I know it's not because of us. I know it's because of the treat you know you have in store. Most journalists and interviewers during the course of a career, of course, interview well-known names, many of them cult names. Very few of them go on to become cult names themselves. But then very few interviewers also have the distinction of having some of their most celebrated guests walk out on them. Two chief ministers, of whom one is now Prime Minister, have walked out on Karan Thapar. A former cricket captain has walked out on Karan Thapar. The country's arguably foremost lawyer nearly walked out on Karan Thapar. And yet, that is not the definition of what it is to be Karan Thapar, because during the course of an extraordinary career, he has not only chronicled, but also challenged public life as we know it. We said in our invitation to you, he is one of the most formidable and volatile faces on television. He is also one who has held up a mirror to our public life in ways that most journalists have not. It is, of course, an exceptional privilege to be able to host this conversation with him. For me in particular, because 2 decades ago, when I started out doing anything at all professionally, my first job was at a channel which was run by Karan. So he was my first boss, except I use that word very loosely because he was my boss in the way that Tim Cook knows me because I own an iPhone, right? I was one step removed from the guard at the door, and Karan was director of programming. All I know is we looked on him with awe and terror when he walked in, and for me, 2 decades later, nothing has changed. It's a privilege. It's a privilege to be able to invite up Karan Thapar. Karan, that was home TV, and it was the late 90s.
It was ages ago.
Yes, I know. Thank you.
I was young, I was black-haired at the time, and I was handsome. So don't remind me of those days.
Well, I was young, I was none of those things, and I'm still terrified, so don't remind me of those.
You're still black-haired. You're still black-haired. You're a lucky girl.
But
Do you know what my barber says to me when I go for a haircut? He says, agar rang lagana hai, to sirf safed hi lagega.
But I do want to start, and I thought I'd start by asking you how journalism found you. But first, I'd like to jump the gun a bit and say, why interviewing? What about the interview format appealed to you of everything that a journalist has open to them to do?
God, you're making me think about an answer for the first time in my life. So let me make one up as I go along. Why interviewing? Because I'm a quarrelsome sort of bugger who likes to ask questions. Because I am pretty dogged and determined, and if I don't get an answer, I can persist. And because I lack discretion. I lack the capacity to say to myself, thus far and no further, look, hang on, you've asked enough, don't go on any further. You're getting to territory where perhaps you shouldn't tread. That's the point at which, not just that I shouldn't tread, I want to jump and leap. So I suppose I've got all the instincts of a showman who likes to revel in making a display of himself, and sometimes a namuna, to use the Punjabi phrase, which is like saying he makes an example of himself. But those are things I can't resist, and that's why I do it.
That's almost making me jump straight up to one of your most iconic interviews, which is the Kapil Dev interview. But I will hold on to that and first say, so how did journalism find you? I think you were in the UK when you started a journalism career. Is that correct?
I love the way you put it. How did journalism find you? Actually, it was me. I was knocking on the door I must have been, let's go back, I must have been roughly, it was 1979, so I would have been 24 years old. I was halfway through a PhD at Oxford, and I'd become aware of the fact that PhDs and I weren't made for each other. I'd done 3 years of research. I hadn't understood very much of what I'd researched, and I decided I needed an escape from this wretched place. So I wrote to 6 newspapers in Britain to say that I'd decided that I would honor them with an application for a job. 3 didn't bother to reply. 2 wrote back in rather polite language, but it effectively amounted to fuck off. But the 6th rang me up. And I'll never forget, the phone was just outside my room at Oxford, and I heard it ringing, and I was sitting in my room at about 12:30 that day, and I picked it up, thinking it's probably for the girl on top who has lots of boyfriends, and they're always ringing. And this voice said, I'd like to speak to Karan Thapar. So I said, that's me. And it was a guy called Charlie Douglas Hume, who at the time was deputy editor of the paper and the foreign editor as well. And he said, look, I've never had such a cheeky letter in my life. I'm keen to know what you look like. Would you come and have lunch? So I said, of course. So he took me to the Caledonian Club in London. And when I arrived, he said, before we get down to business, let's order. What are you going to have? So I looked at the menu, and my eyes fell on haggis. I said, oh, I'm going to have haggis. And he looked at me and said, you sure? I said, yes. He said, do you know what it is? Now, I couldn't tell him I didn't. And I hadn't the faintest idea what haggis was. So I just looked at him and said, of course, I've had it many times before. 10 minutes later, when the wretched stuff arrived, it was the inside of a sheep's stomach. And my face fell, and he looked at me and he said, serves you bloody right, you eat all of it. To cut a long story short, during lunch he said to me, you've done the opposite of Norman St. John Stevens. Now, Norman St. John Stevens was a minister in Mrs. Thatcher's cabinet at the time. He had been at Cambridge and he had gone to Oxford. He was president of the Cambridge Union and then he went to Oxford. So I said, no, I haven't done the opposite. I've done exactly the same. He said, let's take a bet on it. We'll go back to my office after lunch, and if you're wrong, I will set the penalty. And I said, and if I'm right? He said, well, we'll see. So we finished lunch, and we went back to his office, and he asked for a who's who, and I was right. And then he said, okay, hang on a second. There's someone coming to see me from India tomorrow. And he looked at his secretary and said, now, who's coming to see me tomorrow? You might know the person. And his secretary said, utterly mispronouncing the name, Noin Toro Segal. So I said, look, I can't believe it. She's my mother's brother's wife. And this combination, this ridiculous story, got me a job.
Given that there are 1 billion or so of us at that point, what are the chances that the one you're related to showed up?
God alone knows. But God alone is the only one who knows.
And what were the early years in journalism like? What did you do?
Make an ass of myself? Do you want a longer answer?
Absolutely.
My first job was as the Times correspondent in Nigeria, covering all of West Africa. And I know it sounds like a grand job for a novice, but in fact it wasn't, because Nigeria and West Africa were shut parts of the world. Nigeria was a dictatorship till then. A man called Shehu Shagari had just taken over as the first civilian president after years of dictators like General Gowon and others. And Shehu Shagari had been in London on a state visit and had met Charlie Douglas Hume at a formal banquet at the Guildhall, where the mayor holds a banquet, and had said to him, why isn't there a Times correspondent in Lagos? So Charlie looked at me the next day and said, you want a job? That's where you're going. So I went to Lagos. It was new. Nigeria is Texan. They are big, grand people. They speak a sort of blunt language. They're all 6 foot tall. They're all 6 foot wide. They laugh heartily. They spend grandly. They drink enormously. They don't say a word of any political interest. They are the most discreet human beings. And the other thing is, they don't like foreigners. They honestly don't like foreigners. If you invite a Nigerian to your home, and I occasionally tried inviting 4 or 5 journalistic friends, they'd all accept. No one, absolutely no one would turn up. And I realized that I wasn't the only human being suffering this discrimination, because one day, the Swiss ambassador invited me and the only other foreign correspondent. Now, Nigeria had 2 foreign correspondents, me and a man called François Arispe, who worked for Agence France Presse, the French news agency. So I was rather thrilled that we'd been invited by a Swiss ambassador. And by the way, it was a sort of Christmas Eve dinner, and we were all told to come in black tie. So I was thrilled. I said, a chance to dress up, Christmas Eve dinner. This sounds grand and jolly. And I said to François, it's going to be fun, isn't it? And he said, not at all. It's going to be bloody dreadful. You and I will be the only guests there. We will sit down to a table laid for 25. No Nigerian will come. He says, the only nice thing is when the evening ends, the Swiss ambassador's wife is so fed up looking at the food that hasn't been eaten that she'd put it in doggy bags and send it back. And that's exactly what happened. We were the only 2 guests, and we came back with all the dinner, and I ate grandly for the next 6 days.
When it comes to interviewing, you seem to always have been drawn to the very direct, as the names of your shows suggest. It's hard talk, it's devil's advocate, it's to the point. Were you always direct, or was that something you felt, was that a manner you adopted for the interviewing process?
Oh, come, just look at me. Am I direct? I'm discreet, I'm evasive, I'm polite, I'm modest. Never do I call a spade, right? I'm full of flattery. I deliberately chose those terms because they were the opposite of what I was.
Well, they've worked very well. And on that note, can we come to some of the interviews? First, before we come to the ones I'd love to hear a little about. In a career of interviewing absolutely everybody there seemed to have been to interview, are there a few that were noteworthy for you, other than the ones I mentioned? Like I said, the ones that...
You want to know the ones that got away?
I'd love to know the ones that got away, the ones that you would have liked to interview. I'd also love to know the ones that proved a harder challenge than you imagined they would be.
Let's start with the harder challenge than I imagined they would be. And the hardest challenge of the lot was not a politician. He was a very young music director and composer, A.R. Rahman. And he was very young at the time because the interview was done in 98 or 99, so it's 20 years ago. And we did it the night he got, or the evening he got, the Padma Bhushan or Padma Shri at Rashtrapati Bhavan. So we all calculated he'd be on a bit of a high, and maybe that's a good night to interview him. And he came to Jamia Millia, where he used to set up studio. This was being done for the BBC program Face to Face. And I had no idea that this is one of the most tongue-tied, shied individuals in the world. I mean, he was so painfully shy that he wouldn't speak. So I asked him a first question. He said, So I found that a bit perplexing. So I asked him a second. He said, Then I asked him a third. He said, So I said, hang on a second. What's the difference between and And he looked at me and he said, It was hell. We did that interview, which lasted for 24 minutes, 3 times. And at the end of the day, when he'd gone, my colleagues and I would sit there, and my producer would say, no, hang on a second, I think the answer to question 1 is longer in version 3. And then my other guy would say, no, hang on a second, no, but the answer to question 4 is longer in version 1. So we were spooling backwards and forwards till we could find answers that actually added up to a total of 24 minutes. He was the shyest individual I have met, the nicest as well. There was nothing offensive or unlikable about him. He was just shy. He wasn't used to promoting himself. He wasn't used to talking about himself. All of this was new to him. I imagine today, after a couple of Oscars under his belt and a lot of success, he's a very different human being. But this was just as Rosa had happened and his name had begun to be known. And he was clearly a genius, but not used to selling himself. The ones that have got away. Well, that darling boy with the dimples in his face who can't make up his mind whether he wants to shave or grow a beard. Do you people recognize who I'm talking about? Rahul Gandhi. About 24 hours after he became an MP for the first time in 2004, I wrote to him to say, would you give me an interview for the BBC? Because I was doing programs for the BBC at the time. It took him a whole month to reply to the letter. But by the way, as far as politicians go, that's pretty quick. And he rang me up on a Sunday and he said, I've got your letter. I'm really keen to do the interview, but would you give me a little time? I think I need to know more about the job I'm doing before I begin to talk about it. I said, that makes perfect sense. So when do you think you can do it? He said, 6 months or a year. I said, fine. Well, not 1 year, but 14 have gone by. And I have written to him regularly. Now he doesn't even bother to reply. So clearly he's one. And
well,
the other...
It's a tough job. He's figuring it out.
Absolutely. I mean, that's not the only thing he's figuring out. He's figuring out, more importantly, how to bring Congress back to power. And if his success is as good as bringing Congress back to power, then I don't think I'm getting an interview in a hurry at all. And the other one who got away, believe it or not, was his mum. In her case, she even invited me to attend Janpath to have what I thought was a preliminary discussion. I can't remember if she gave me any coffee or not. I sort of think she didn't, otherwise I'd remembered it. But anyway, we sat there rather politely, and I explained why I wanted an interview, and it was for the BBC, and she said, I will. And then, again, Several years went by, but she didn't. So I met her one day at a man called Ashwini Kumar. He used to be, he still is, in fact, the owner of Punjab Kestri, and he was an MP in those days as well. And I met her at a drinks party at Ashwini Kumar's, and I said to her, Mrs. Gandhi, you promised you'd give me an interview 4 years ago, but you haven't. And she looked at me, and she said, but I never said when.
The Kapil Dev interview, and the reason it occupies, is everybody in the room familiar with the Kapil Dev interview? Yeah. It was the single episode, I think, in our collective memory of an iconic figure in public life, in this case, our most iconic cricket captain, having an extended spell of weeping on national television, right? Now, my question is, why did you, when he started to cry somewhere around minute 11, why did you continue to let him cry till the end?
Because it would have been such a terrible anticlimax if his eyes had stopped crying, he cheered up and started laughing. I mean, just think of it. I grew up in a television environment in England, where my first job was for the first 10 years of my life, where it was believed that there were two things that were absolute magic on TV. Little kids laughing and adults howling. And now this interview began, and I was asking him pretty straightforward questions that he knew I was going to ask. And for 10 minutes, to use a cricket metaphor, he batted perfectly. And then at some point around the 10th, 11th minute, as you said, I said to him, does it worry you that one day people will say, Kapil Dev, the man who won the World Cup for India, Kapil Dev, the highest wicket taker of his time, which he was at that moment. And then they'll add the guy who took 25 lakhs to throw a match. And at that point, he threw his head back and he began bawling. His eyes began streaming. His nose began running. His voice began breaking. He was frequently doing this because his nose was running. And he was howling. And I said to myself, this is sheer magic. I've dreamt of this all my wretched life, and here it is happening in front of me. And then I said to myself, oh Christ, I've got 15 minutes more of this interview. But what do I do? How do I ensure that he continues to howl? Because the one thing I do not want is that Kapil should suddenly become dry-eyed, cheery, start laughing, and this moment of magic will have dissipated. Poof, it'll be gone. And I said, equally, there's a bit of a dilemma here for me. If I'm a brute, I lose the sympathy of the audience, and I can't afford to do that. So I have to think very quickly of a way that Kapil keeps howling, but the audience don't think I'm a brute. And by the way, I know this sounds hard to believe, but all of those Machiavellian thoughts were racing through my mind in literally 10 seconds flat. And the answer I devised was, keep asking nasty questions, but make your voice as soft and gentle as you can. So that's what I did. I deliberately and consciously lowered my voice, made it soft and gentle, but I made the questions as nasty as possible, and hooray, he howled all the way to the end. But let me add, by the way, as soon as it ended, he stopped. I said, how about a cup of coffee? He said, yes, and can we have some biscuits too?
I have asked this before, but I will ask it again. Is heartlessness an essential part of being a good interviewer?
Heartless?
Because that...
Heartless? Would you use that word to describe me?
Only under very...
Come on.
Only under very polite circumstances.
No, I don't know whether heartlessness is an essential quality in an interviewer, but I do believe that you have to somewhat steel yourself. Look, every human being, including nasty, horrible interviewers, do know that there are moments when you are crossing delicate lines. All of us know it. And you decide in your mind, what am I supposed to do here? I have a job. And let me not take the contentious example of making Kapil Dev cry, because that's emotional. Let me take an example of pushing a politician to the point at which, perhaps in your mind you are aware that you are doing them personal damage, right? In your mind. And you say to yourself, what's my job? To push the point I'm making, because it isn't fully answered as yet, but I'll do so at the cost of causing the individual in front of me some personal damage. Not political damage, that I don't worry about, but personal damage. I could hurt his ego and in a way deflate him and destroy his self-esteem. And that's not something you want to do to any individual. And the alternative is stop questioning, fall short deliberately of the goal you set yourself, rein yourself in because you want to avoid hurting, upsetting, and personally damaging an individual. And I assure you, there's not a single interviewer in the world who hasn't at some point had to face that dilemma, that question, at least once.
Is there a particular interview that comes to mind for you when you think of that?
Possibly one with Ram Jethmalani, except for the fact that he gave so well as he got, that I don't think he suffered any damage at all. Not at all. But certainly the thought went through my mind at that point. And there was, that's when he walked out. He actually did walk out, but he walked out in a way that still maintained his dignity because he walked out suggesting he was affronted. It was my interpretation that he'd walked out because actually I thought he'd been exposed. That's one occasion. But the point is, when you face that sort of dilemma, you do ask yourself, what do I do? And I think if you want to continue to be a journalist whose first function is to be a journalist, then you have to persist. And if you end up damaging a person's amour propre, well, that's horribly unfortunate, but you've only damaged it because the individual made a mistake in the first place. And you haven't stopped short of exposing it. You haven't damaged it because you're gratuitously stabbing him in the back. It's because you're exposing an error or a lapse or a misjudgment on his part, which needs to be exposed. And at the end of the day, these are elected individuals that you and I and everyone else in this room have chosen to rule us. Why should their misdeeds, their lapses, their misjudgments, their mistakes be protected? So, whilst it's a difficult thing to do, and by the way, it doesn't happen with every interview. It happens once or twice a lifetime. But I have no qualms on that odd occasion when I've decided to persist.
And yet, does it get difficult, or does it get particularly difficult when you're also friends of a sort with the people you're interviewing?
Hugely.
And the case I have in mind is L.K. Advani, because I think there's...
No, I'll give you a better example.
Okay.
It's in my book, so I'm not making up something that I haven't talked about before. A much better example of how it is always invidious and wrong, and frankly, I think you should not do it, is to interview a friend, particularly when the friend is a politician, particularly when she happens to be Prime Minister of a wretched country, and particularly when you're an Indian, that country is Pakistan, and you look upon each other as enemies, and at the back of your mind is the belief that my countrymen would expect me to... And I ought not to use that colloquial word, screw her, because that's not what I mean, but you get the gist of what I'm suggesting. The lady I'm talking about is Benazir Bhutto. I knew Benazir from when I was 19 and 20, and she was 19 and 20 at the time. And we had known each other a very long time, and she was a very good friend. Every time that she was Prime Minister that I interviewed her, and she was well aware that there was a conflict of interest here. She would agree to an interview in the belief that she was giving an interview to a friend who at some point would be understanding and sympathetic, not immediately, but at some point. I was getting an interview as a journalist who thought that, God, it's quite a catch to interview the Prime Minister of Pakistan, and I need to push this point. It's a big controversy in my country. I want to push it as far as I can. And there's obviously a conflict of interest because she thinks at some point you will not carry on and you persist because you think it's your job to do. But she was an extremely wise, sagacious, and actually a very thoughtful, understanding, and more than that, a very sensitive and warm human being. Because she knew at the back of her mind, every single time this was going to lead to a problem. And every time the interview ended, she'd laugh and say, time for ice cream. You need something to cool down. You need to cool down pretty quickly, Karan, or we'll never be friends again. Right? And it happened regularly, whether I interviewed her in Islamabad, which I did when she was Prime Minister, where I interviewed her as leader of the opposition many times in London. But you know, no doubt there were 24, 36 hours of pain. But at no point ever did she hold it against me. At no point ever did she refuse another interview. And what I remember, by the way, when she was Prime Minister of Pakistan and my wife Nisha was dying in hospital in London, the one person, this is really odd, the one person who'd ring me every single night at 11 or 12 just to talk for 10 minutes was her. Because she said, I know what you're going through. I went through it when my father died. And she said, it helps just to talk to someone. And she said, I'm 5,000 miles away, but if we've made a habit of talking for 10 days, it's easier to keep talking to me than it is to start with someone else. And I'll never forget that she made that effort for 24 days every day.
She's clearly an example of one end of the political spectrum that is unusual. But this proximity to power and influence, what has it shown you up close about both power and politics? Does politics affect the nature of politicians? Or does the character of politicians make politics what it is? Is power the problem, or are politicians the problem?
I think it's a bit of both, isn't it? There's no doubt that there are some individuals in politics whose character, behavior, attitude, response, and manner is affected by the fact that they have now become important in politics. They become arrogant. They become unbearable even. Often when they become ministers, often when they become influential.
I don't suppose you want to take any names, do you?
The problem is not taking names. The problem is, which name would I not take? There are very few exceptions to this, I assure you. But by the way, let's be honest. This is true of most of us. Think of it. When you, in whatever profession you are, rise rapidly to the top, become well-known, become famous, people seek you after, they want selfies with you and autographs with you, people congregate around you. By the way, most of the time they're just flattering you. That is not a reflection of what they actually think of you. They're simply, what's that lovely phrase we have in India? Buttering you up. And you fall for the bloody trap because you think it's genuine. But never mind, they win when this is up. But it happens in all professions. The problem with politicians is when it happens to them, it happens publicly and visibly. So yes, clearly, politicians get affected by success in politics. Does the nature of politics also change? Sometimes, because if you have hugely dominant people as your top leader, we do in India today, a man with a 56-inch chest, and that's the only part of his body that I'm going to measure. I have no idea what the rest is. Then there's Winston Churchill in history, who dominated England. There's the myth of the Kennedys, although perhaps it wasn't as strong when he was in power. It's become more of a myth afterwards. These are people who exercised an influence, and as a result of which, when the history of their period is written, it will be inextricable from the influence the individual exercised. You can't talk about the Second World War without involving the role of Winston Churchill. I imagine a time will come when we will not be able to talk about 2014 to 2019 or whenever it ends without the role of Narendra Modi, because of the enormous influence that he has exercised on us and our country. So it does work in reverse, but it works in reverse only with select people, not everyone.
But on that note, the Narendra Modi interview, because
you were going to come to that, weren't you?
I was, but there's no better time than now. The 3-minute interview. How did a 24-minute interview become a 3-minute one?
Do you want the short answer?
Not at all. I want the 56-inch answer.
I think these days, by the way, it's not his chest that's 56 inches. Every time I see him, I have a horrible feeling the waist is catching up. The interview was arranged for me by Arun Jaitley. And Mr. Modi, who I had written to several times till then and had ignored my letters, immediately agreed. When I arrived in Ahmedabad airport at about 8:30 in the morning, As soon as I got out of the plane and into the car, and I was driving to the hotel, the phone rang and it was Narendra Modi. He said, "आ गए आप?" मैंने कहा, "हाँ जी, मैं आ गया." अरे यार, हमारा इंटरव्यू 5 बजे है। मैंने कहा, "हाँ जी, तो 4:30 आओ यार, बातचीत करेंगे." मैंने कहा, "ज़रूर, मैं 4:30 आ जाऊँगा." And I was rather touched that the chief minister had actually wronged me. And of course I knew at the back of my mind that this was done as a way of impressing a journalist. But I said, good for him. Good politicians find clever ways of impressing journalists, and that's good behavior. There's nothing wrong in that. Good politicians do it abroad all the time. So this built him up in my mind. And then I arrived at 4:30 and we bantered and chatted about all sorts of things but the interview. And that was actually quite engaging and good fun. At 5 o'clock or shortly thereafter, we sat down. And now, I said to myself, I'm talking to the Chief Minister of Gujarat as he's poised for his second election to become Chief Minister a second time. So clearly, I have to talk to him about the challenges he faces in Gujarat, which he may not have answered, and what are his responses to those challenges hereafter. That's a major part, I don't deny it. But I also have to talk to him about what happened in Gujarat in 2002 and in Godhra in particular, because that is a sort of cloud that hovers over him and it affects the way the country thinks of him, and it would be wrong not to bring it up. The question is, at what point of the interview do I do so? Do I do it at the start and risk putting him off? Do I leave it till the middle? Or perhaps even the end? But the danger is if I don't do it at the start, he and I both will know that there is a sort of Damocles hanging over this interview, and it will make him tense, and it will probably restrict him, and therefore it's best to bring it up, discuss it, get it over with, clear the air, and move on. And that's precisely what I chose to do. The second problem was, what sort of phraseology or language do I use when I bring this up? And I said to myself, I am essentially asking him a couple of questions here from the point of view of those who are most aggrieved, most hurt, and believe have most suffered. Who are those? The 1,000 Muslims who've been killed, and the Muslim community, which is 7% of Gujarat, who believe that injustice has been done to them. Because clearly, no Hindu is aggrieved in Gujarat about the way the chief minister has handled the situation. Now, if I were to ask the question on their behalf, what is the language they would use? They would describe him as a mass killer. That's a provocative term. That is a term that's bound to annoy him. So do I use something softer, gentler, and euphemistic? And I said to myself again, if I use something softer, gentler, and euphemistic, I'm not conveying the truth of what they feel. And since I'm asking the question to give him an idea of what they feel, and they are his constituents, not mine, then I should use their language. And if I don't, and I make it gentler, then I'm misleading him, and I'm not conveying what they actually think. So my first question was, Mr. Modi, you're 6 weeks away from an election. India Today magazine and the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation look upon you as the best chief minister in the country. But unfortunately, 140 million Muslims consider you a mass murderer. Do you have an image problem? And he looked at me and he said, it's only people like Karan Thapar that say those things. So I said, well, that's not true. The Chief Justice of India in 2004, in open court, had called you a modern-day Nero who deliberately chose to look the other way whilst innocent children and helpless women burnt to death. And that was the Chief Justice of India saying it. So he said, but it was only a spoken comment, not a written judgment. Now, at the time, by the way, I did agree that it was only a spoken comment and not a written judgment. Later, Teesta Setalvad sent me the judgment. So, in fact, it was written by the Chief Justice in cold print. It was a written judgment. But at the time, I thought, he thought, the whole country thought this was a spoken comment. So I said, but so what? How does it matter whether it's spoken or written? If the Chief Justice of India has said this of you, does it not worry you? He said, I've said what I had to say. So I said, all you have to do is publicly express apology and regret for what's happened. put it behind you, and carry on. Otherwise, this problem is an albatross around your neck, and it is restricting your capacity to work for the good of Gujarat. And it's within your power to put it behind you, just express regret or an apology, and it's over. And he said, I've said what I have to say. So I said, say it again. By then, 3 minutes were over. And he said to me, mujhe pani chahiye. So I said, aapke badal mein pada hai. Poor chap, he only had a glass of water. I'm a lot lucky, I've got a glass of wine. And he took his mic off, and I realized, mujhe pani chahiye is a bahana for the fact he didn't want to talk. Let me add, give me a minute more, that actually he was extremely hospitable thereafter. It would be fundamentally wrong of me not to tell you that. He was as warm and generous as a brother could have been. He fed me with mithai, dokla, badam, kishmish, kaju, and lots of tea. And we carried on chatting for a whole hour. I spent the entire 1 hour trying to persuade him to do the interview. I said to him, if the problem was that I brought this up at the start and it spoiled your mood, I'll bring it up again. I'll do it and we'll leave it to the end. You know it's going to come up, so it's no surprise, but I'll do it at the end. He said, no, mood bigad gaya hai, ab rehne do. So I said, okay, let me leave another thought with you. Agar aap mujhe sirf 3 minute ka hissa denge, to mera channel ise har news bulletin mein play karega. Aur kal 36 baar dikhaya jayega, because it will be a new story. But if you do the full interview, it will be shown once, repeated once, and forgotten. But even that didn't work. So at the end of an hour, I said, Modi ji, maaf karega, mujhe jana hi padega, maine jahaz pakadna hai, mujhe wapas Delhi jana hai. So I got up, we shook hands, and I left. And obviously, the next day, the channel did exactly what I said they would do. They showed it as a news story. It became an item that everyone watched. And at 4 or 5 that evening, he rang me. I was sitting in my office, and he said, Karan, brother, mere kandhe pe banduk rakh ke goli mar rahe ho. So I said, Modi sahab, maine aapko kaha tha kal. एक बार नहीं, कम से कम 10 बार कि आप पूरा इंटरव्यू दीजिएगा. अगर 2 मिनट के हिस्से या 3 मिनट के हिस्से के साथ मुझे वापस भेजेंगे तो यही होगा. He said, चलो छोड़ो मेरे दोस्त. And the next was that he said, I will never forget. He said, Karan, I love you. जब दिल्ली आएंगे तो भोजन करेंगे. Now, I don't know about the love, but there's never been any bhojan.
Have there been interviewees who took the questions you didn't think they would take and answered them with more candor than you would have thought?
Several. Actually, a remarkably large number, because we have a somewhat pejorative attitude of politicians, and I hear plead guilty. Journalists like me have helped people believe the worst of politicians, and let me make a significant correction to that. There are several politicians who've answered not just fully, remarkably honestly, and without prodding, without my having to push them. And in that number, L.K. Advani of the BJP, Sitaram Yechury of his own party, the CPM, Mani Shankar Iyer, Salman Khurshid. Believe it or not, before he became a minister, Ravi Shankar Prasad. Unfortunately, after he became a minister, he became a very different human being. Oh, and repeatedly, I can't forget this, Arun Jaitley. Arun would often surprise me with not just the candor and honesty of his answers, but also by his willingness to step in and help when, in fact, his party or his leader had created the problem. Can I tell that story?
Absolutely.
Again, it's all in my book. There was a moment when L.K. Advani had given me an interview in 2009, and 10 minutes into the interview, he didn't like the way it was going. He ended it. I tried desperately hard to convince him to continue, but he wouldn't. And by then it was 7 in the evening. And whatever the interview was had to be shown the next day. And I panicked and I said, what the hell do we do for tomorrow? We've got a hole. This man's not giving an interview. So I rang up Arun from the courtyard of L.K. Advani's home. And he knew that I was going to LK Advani for interview. He says, "So kya hoga? Interview khatam ho gaya?" I said, "Nahi yaar, there's a problem." He said, "You've annoyed him again." I said, "Yes." "So you're ringing for me to fill the gap?" I said, "Yes, for God's sake, Karan, yes." "Acha, te 10 baje aa jayega?" "Main kya roti kha ke?" He said, "Haan." I said, "Of course." There I was at 10 o'clock. He gave the interview. And his only condition was, before we start, Puri kahani te das hoya ki budde naal. And I told him the whole story. He gave the interview. And he's the only, let me be honest, he's one of few politicians who frequently stepped into the brief. We've had lots of quarrelsome interviews, but he's never held them against me. Never. And he's always stepped in, particularly when his own party people dropped out. So I have to say that he's remarkable in that respect.
The interview process in general for a lot of these has been, you've said the parts you often enjoy most are people who seem to be answering the question but are actually very skilled often at deflecting. So the art of the skillful banter, and who would you say is a really skilled interviewee? Not just, I will ask you who you think are fellow skilled interviewers, but interviewees first.
The art of answering without answering is a brilliant art. Because you sitting in front of him say to yourself, that sounds like an answer, right? It's long enough to qualify as an answer, but it's not at all about what I asked. And yet, he hasn't avoided the subject. He's just gently, cleverly, skillfully, actually bloody brilliantly deflected it. And you know what the conclusion is? He's making a monkey of me. And not just making, he's made a monkey of me. And suddenly your heart drops and you lose a bit of confidence because in your mind there are just two thoughts. How do I get back? And it's important I get back, very important I get back. And then, but I don't know how to do it. And the more you think of I don't know how to do it, the worse it becomes. So God, those are awful moments. There are several like that. I mean, I suppose at the top would be, believe it or not, Narasimha Rao.
I can believe it.
Honestly, Narasimha Rao was the only human being I knew who would begin to answer a question and you'd say to yourself, "Oh, he's locked on. We're getting where we are." And suddenly, we'd veer off in a different direction, but so gently done that until about a minute, you wouldn't realize we've changed the subject. And then you'd say to yourself, "Hang on a second, I need to get back here." And as soon as you started to interrupt, he said, "No, but just hang on a moment. I'm coming to the point you're making." And he'd go further and further away. The man was absolutely brilliant. At the end of 5 minutes, he'd have told you 4 times, "I'm coming to the point you're making," which he hadn't come to, and he'd ended up in Calcutta. And the man was brilliant. And bringing the interview back to what you wanted to talk about was about the most difficult thing you could do. So he was brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
It's not the same thing at all, but I would love you to tell us the Jayalalitha story, because that's a different type of interviewee.
Yes, indeed. Okay. The Jayalalitha story begins when I first wrote to her, and she accepted. But on the evening of the interview, I got rung up and to be told, "Madam wants to change her mind." So I said, "What's the problem?" "No, Madam does not want to give the interview tomorrow." So I said, "Okay, fine. The day after that, no, Madam will tell you when she wants to give the interview." So I said, "When will that be?" "Madam will tell you." And it didn't happen for another 6 months. But 6 months later, Madam changed her mind. And Madam decided she wanted to give an interview, so I was equally peremptorily rung up and told, "Madam will give you an interview." And I was thrilled. And this was for the BBC program Heart Talk. At this time, we thought it will sail through. The night before I was flying to Chennai for the interview, it was the phone again. And I said, "Oh my God, Madam's had another change of heart." And the phone rang and the man says, "Madam says, instead of doing the interview at 1, can we do it at 1:30? So I said, "Yes, but what's the problem with 1? "Oh, no, it is not auspicious, sir. The stars are not in alignment." I said, "Oh, don't worry. The stars matter to me as much as they do to Madam. Let's do it at 1:30. Actually 2:32 if you want." So I arrived. It was on the top floor of Fort St. George, and it was bloody freezing cold. The thermostats had been set to 15 because Madam insisted that's the temperature she liked. Secondly, they'd put a table in the middle, and there was a huge flower decoration. And I said, hang on a second, you can't have a flower decoration between me and the interviewee. I won't be able to see her face. I'll be just looking at roses. So I got there, I picked up the flowers, and I moved them aside. And the chief secretary, none other, came running and said, you can't do that. So I said, why can't I? He said, because Madam wants the flowers. I said, well, maybe, but I don't, and I'm doing the interview, and I moved them, and I said, I'm sorry. I need to look at Madam's face, not at a rose as I asked the question. At which point, the doors opened, and if there were trumpets, they would have blown, and entered Madam. Now, by the way, Madam wasn't exactly svelte and delicate. She was a sizable presence, wrapped in a Tamil silk sari. She was quite a striking thing, and she literally, like an armada, sailed down. So I walked up to Madam and I said, Chief Minister, what a pleasure to meet you. I said, I've moved those flowers. Why? She said. I said, because I would much rather spend my time looking at a beautiful face than a beautiful flower. And believe it or not, this thoroughly third-rate flattery made Madam grin. Madam grinned from side to side, sat down in front of me, and the interview began. As soon as it began, I noticed that Madam had 6 pieces of paper, all A4, spread across. And I said to myself, what the hell is that? I mean, normally it's the interviewer who's got questions, but Madam seems to have answers. Anyway, as the interview proceeded, which, by the way, she didn't like, the questions, just like Mr. Modi found them a bit offensive, so did Madam. In this instance, I'm saying it from memory, so forgive me if I've got it wrong, but the first question was, you've been variously described as arrogant, intolerant, powerful, you dislike dissent, you're autocratic, and I think the end was, which of these most accurately describes you? They were all from the Tamil papers. I wasn't making it up. Somehow, Madam thought that I had selected the adjectives with a bit of discrimination that she didn't approve of. Anyway, from that moment onwards, the interview progressed, well, I would say upwards towards anger, but maybe downwards in her taste. And I then discovered that Madam was frequently looking at the pieces of paper as she was answering. So at one point I said, you're reading answers. So she said to me, but you've got questions. I said, but my having questions is legitimate. But what answers have you got there? I mean, on what basis have you got answers to questions? Anyway, we got pretty close to the end when I said, oh dear, this interview has not progressed what I would say sweetly and nicely. We've got to the end of the interview where I think Madam is positively bloody angry with me. So a minute or two towards the end, I said, let me try and see if I can recover lost ground. And I said, are you a misunderstood woman? And she looked at me, she said, yes, I am. And it's all because of people like you. So I said, oh dear, that didn't work. I said, well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. And she rose from her chair. I put out a hand to thank her, and she grasped a hand in a namaste and said, frankly, she said, it hasn't been a pleasure talking to you. Turned around and sailed out of the room. And the BBC were very clever. The last shot of the interview is Madam turning around and sailing out of the room. Yeah.
So actually, the bell did ring much as requiring us to sail out of the room. But before we end, on a more serious note, I did want to ask...
What be on a more serious note? Have I not been serious up till now?
Well, I mean, I'd love to ask Jayalalitha what she thinks. But the
I can put you through if you want.
She might need lessons from Benazir. It's a very global question, but the state of the media. how do you feel about the state of the media? And this too, we have discussed this before. It's been said previously that during the emergency, when asked to bend, editors chose to crawl. And I think it was L.K. Advani who said it. What are editors doing now?
They're not distinguishing themselves. You know, what's happening at the moment is both more subtle than what happened during the emergency, but also more invidious. You don't have obvious censorship. You don't have censors sitting in newspaper offices. You don't have power supply to newspapers being cut off so that they can't publish the next day in the morning. You don't have journalists being arrested under coffee poser or Misa or whatever the acts in the 1970s were called. But you have something that is much more invidious. You have subtle phone calls and pressure that result in self-censorship. And so many journalists who would have proudly written details, exposed facts, revealed truths that show up the government in a true light, even if it's an embarrassing light for the government, now suppress them because they don't want to face what they think might be the consequences to themselves, to their families, to their wives, to their children. And when journalists start self-censoring, when editors start editing columns of their, columnists, when words and adjectives are dropped because they're considered to be too harsh, because they're actually too truthful, not because they're exaggerated. When you're told, don't say it this week, say it 2 months later, because we want to invite the Prime Minister in 10 days' time and we don't want to give an excuse for saying no, then actually something worse is happening. You're actually putting into the minds of journalists the seeds of doubt and suppression. And I think it is less obvious, but worse, if that contradiction is acceptable to you. Less obvious, not done so brutally, so crudely as it was in the 70s, but it's happening. Anchors are being boycotted. Channels are being told, don't renew contracts of anchors because we don't like them. If you want us to appear on your programs, gently break your contract or don't renew your contract. In other instances, anchors like on ABP have been actually dropped. Columnists have been discontinued. Editors of newspapers have been quietly terminated, although sent back, no doubt, with handsome payoffs, but terminated nonetheless. Those are hateful, invidious ways of doing it, because you can't point the finger back at the government in the same direct way as you could in the emergency. But every single editor, journalist, columnist, anchor knows it's happening. And let me tell you, the government knows it's doing it. The two people at the top, or the three, know what they're doing, and they know that they're doing it, but no one will ever say they did it.
If editors don't show the spine they need to, what can readers, consumers of news, watchers, viewers, what can we do to demand more?
The honest answer is not very much. I know that's a disappointing answer. You'll often be told by people, don't buy newspapers. How can you not buy newspapers? We all need to know what's happened, even if what you're being told is simply city news and daily news. But you need to know it. You can't stop buying newspapers. What's the other alternative? Don't watch TV? How can you not watch TV? The so-called power that the audience has of not to buy or not to watch is not a power, because you have to have newspapers to know what's happening. No matter how ill-informed or misinformed or prejudicially informed you are, you can't stop buying them. You can't stop watching TV. So yes, what's the answer? There's not much we can do. We sit and wait and suffer and pray to Allah or Ram or Krishna or Jesus or Mary or Moses or any one of the lords above. Let change happen. Let Achhe Din come. What else can we do?
I wish there were a more optimistic note to end this on, but thank you, Karan, for your candor. Thank you for your time. Thank you.
Will the government thank me too?
I think it's mutually exclusive. If we're thanking you, they're not.
No. Look at the interviews our dear, glorious Prime Minister has given. He welcomes criticism. He said so repeatedly. I believe I have spoken in the spirit of his wishes. I dedicate this evening to the wonderful man who is our Prime Minister. As they say in Britain, long may he reign over us.
Karan's books, more than one, but most recently Devil's Advocate, your memoir, I think, and a couple of others, As I Like It. They're available outside. Do use the opportunity to buy copies and have them.
Oh yes, can I put in a word there? Do please use the opportunity.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Karan, as always.